I was going to say that.
I took your line. People have been telling me I look exhausted. I think some people think I've been drinking all night because my eyes are red.
They're right.
They're not right. And I can't sleep. There's too much excitement, too much energy flowing around for me in these last few days and right now in this moment. My mother used to say this is sort of a age-old problem for me, that I would never nap and I would never want to go to bed because I was always afraid I would miss something. So that's, I think, what's happening. I try to sleep at night, and I'm just the ideas and the conversations, and every conversation is just a little snippet of one. I feel like I'm at my wedding or at a big decade birthday where all the people from my life are there and I want to talk with them, but I don't have time and I keep getting pulled. Who else would ever say a conference was like a wedding or a birthday party? And what have we created here? I mean, what a community that coming together to talk about these ideas and how we put them into practice has that kind of elevated energy that is keeping us all overstimulated, or at least, and maybe this is just my problem. Well, Diana has
There are many.
So what is it that we're doing here that creates that energy and that passion? What is it about relational ways of understanding the world and engaging with others that gives us that life? I have the great privilege in my professional life to be able to introduce to students these ideas, students who have never heard of them before. It's a challenge. It's a challenge I love. And there's a lot of resistance. There's a lot of holding on to me, myself, what's right for me. You don't have the right to tell me to do that. I'm going to defend myself. I'm going to engage in the argumentative, persuasive tradition because that's what I have to do. Because there are rights and there are wrongs and there are goods and there are bads. And then eventually, like halfway through the semester, they start saying, wow, this is really incredible, but there's a real problem with it. This happens every time. I say, what's the problem? Well, other people don't know about this. And if they don't know about it, how good is it? I mean, just me, just us? We're going to know this small group of people? So for me, that's really the crux, and it does have echoes of what I said on the opening night about practice, because I don't think people really have to know. It's great to know the theory. It's great to read about all the ideas connected with a constructionist philosophical stance and read about relational theory. But that's not the most important piece. The important piece is doing it, putting it into action. And this is a room full of people who do put that into action. So one of the things that I also have been thinking about is, what would it be like if our institutions were seeped in this way of thinking? No one really taught us to be modernists. No one really taught us individualism. I mean, they did, the textbooks that we had and so forth. But our institutions have all been constructed, in this model that Ken was laying out. And we just took it for granted. Imagine a world where what we're talking about was unquestioningly the premise upon which all our institutions were formed, our ways of living in community with one another. Everything we did was from this collaborative, relational stance where we recognize that meaning really is in what we do together. What we're doing is more important than anything else, because in that moment we're creating our worlds with each other. We're creating who we are. That would be a fabulous world. if that was the taken for granted way of orienting ourselves. So how might we do that? How might we think about, I think this is the topic that we're all engaged in here in our time together. You know, how can we do more of this? We're all doing it, but how do we do more of it? And I think this is where, as Ken was talking, I was thinking, maybe I'll get up and do a Ken light, you know. Ken does the heavy, I'll do the light, okay? So I think we need to, where I come into this, you know, everybody takes some of the terms that are associated with this work. Collaboration, relational, multiplicity. The term I really like to have as my entry point is difference, the idea of leaning into the difference. So the way I like to talk about it, and this is the Ken Light part, what he's described here, I just like to have a sort of cheat sheet about how to understand these ideas. And I think it's useful to introduce people to this because it helps us see how difference is everywhere. Where in a modernist world, we're trying to find similarity, overlap, commonality, stability, yet we're living in a swirl of difference. So the way we could talk about it in many ways, but if we start with the idea that we coordinate, there's coordination among people and our environments. We're constantly engaging in coordinated activities. It's just something that happens. And for me, I have an image of hovering over Mexico City and looking at the traffic, okay? It's really well coordinated. When from that helicopter view, you're seeing, you know, in and out, back and forth, cutting people off, just a mess. But it's a kind of beautiful coordination. It's a dance. When you're in it, it doesn't feel that way. When you're in it, it's frightening. Okay. People walking down a busy street, most of the time, don't bump into each other. You know, rush hour people. We coordinate. We coordinate with our environment. We coordinate with each other. And one of the interesting things about coordination is that rituals or patterns emerge very quickly. So I always use the example of my students' first day of the seminar. They walk in, they sit down around the table. Second time we meet, I walk into the room, they're sitting in exactly the same place. Third time, same place, okay? So it doesn't take long in our coordinated activities. They've coordinated that, and all of a sudden there is a pattern. And from those patterns, standards and expectations emerge. So, if on the fourth day that I meet with my students, a new person comes a little earlier and sits where Diana's sitting, and then she walks in, it's like, hey, that's my seat. You might not say it, but you think it. So very quickly, once we have this established pattern, we have what we expect, how the world should be, which generates, we could call it realities, we could call it worldviews, we could call it values and beliefs, we could call it moral orders, social orders. I think all those terms are interchangeable. So, a whole way of acting in the world. This is how we should do things. No, this is the truth. This is the way it is. Okay? Now these values and beliefs feed into our further coordination patterns. However, it's not such a simple process as this because we're engaging constantly with each other and with others. Think of all the interactions, real and virtual and imagined, that we have every day. This this set of values and beliefs could generate a different form of coordination. Okay, so we're engaged in relational processes. Okay, this is not an individual, these are relational engagements, also with the environment. Okay, so why would we ever expect that there could be one answer, one truth, one right way of being? We live, even ourselves, with competing views. And generally, when we engage in communities where we have vast differences, our approach is to ask, which is right or which is wrong? Or how do I get this one over here? Or how do I find this little bit of consensus, perhaps, that people might share? Okay, I think from what we know about making a world together, if we think of it in these terms, if we can accept and embrace and lean into this difference that's all around, then it's not about consensus. It's about coordinating multiplicity. How do we keep all of those worldviews, all of those ways of being simultaneously in the air? I have an image of juggling, and having the balls, and somehow let them touch each other occasionally. How do we avoid coming to consensus, which I think is problematic? People with very different views come together. They put out, metaphorically, on the table what they want. Through a process of negotiation, they start taking back. Okay. What's left in the middle of the table is the smallest amount of stuff that everyone can agree with. And of course, everyone who leaves that process thinks that they've given up more than anybody else. And there's not much investment in maintaining the common consensus. So let's not try to make people think the way we think. Let's try, if we start with this premise that this is really what's going on, these multiple ways of being in the world, how do we become curious about that? How do we open a conversation so that we can begin to make some new meaning together in this sort of process that will be neither this nor that, and not just a little bit of this or a little bit of that, but will be something entirely new, a new form of understanding. And I think that's another point that these ideas really always bring me to, is we're talking about creating ways of understanding one another, not necessarily focusing on agreements. Usually, when we confront difference, the propensity is to, figure out how we can come to an agreement. What if we suspend that? Agreements are necessary eventually, but suspend them and ask, how can we understand each other? Can I become curious? Can I hold the tension that dialogue offers, where the tension is between having my perspective, but also recognizing that you have yours, and becoming curious about that? So how do we do that in practice? And I think, that's a conversation everyone in this room could answer in terms of what you do. I think some of the tools or some of the resources that a constructionist approach offers us is, and for me this is so primary, is the reflexive position. In a modernist world, and I don't mean to make harsh divides of good bad here, because it's just a discourse, but we don't engage in reflexivity. If you ask someone, why did you do that? They generally say, because that's the way it's done. There's no reflection on how else could we do this? How else might we enter into conversation with one another? Can I be so sure that I really know what that other person is trying to do? Are there other ways I can do this? What other voices can I use? What other voices might I invite from the other? In addition, we can engage in relational reflexivity, and I've heard people talking about that here in the last couple of days. Just asking the question, how are we doing? Is this the kind of conversation that you were hoping we would have? Are there questions you wanted me to ask that I'm not asking? Topics that we should be talking about that we haven't been talking about? As professionals, I think people fear asking those questions because it appears to be incompetence. You're supposed to know exactly what you're doing. But if we know too soon, then we aren't engaging in that reflexive inquiry. So that's a practice, that's a resource, reflexive inquiry. Another resource is coordinating the multiplicity, as I mentioned before. Instead of trying to reach consensus, how do we keep that conversation going? How do we hold that tension between my position and yours? And another, just the last resource I'll mention is what many of us do in our work is focus on the future. One of the interesting things for me to think about is that when we work with people, and particularly if we're focused on, as consultants or therapists, we're focusing on a problem. The question, when did the problem begin? Okay, not if you're doing appreciative inquiry, but that question invites people into a causal logic. I ask you when the problem began, you go back to a point in time, and the presumption is that caused right now, what's happened right now, and what's happening right now will cause what's happening in the future. But if we ask people about the future, how would things be if your life was perfect, if your organization was thriving? We actually invite people into a moment of co-construction. We invite them to create that future. And following that kind of question with actions, what are the three things you'll do? Yesterday's health group that reported out and came up here and said, on Monday morning, I'm going to. That was part of that. You can have a great conversation. How are you going to put that reality into action? So I will leave it with that response. Thank you.